I checked the mission parameters one more time as the Kronos descended through the crushing darkness, but the numbers still didn't add up right. 15 years of deep-sea salvage work had taught me to trust my instruments. Yet every reading on this operation felt off by degrees I couldn't explain. 3 kilometers and descending, Captain Rodriguez announced from her command station, her voice steady despite the pressure readings that made my stomach clench. Maintain current descent rate. The target object had appeared on sonar 3 days ago at depths that should have been impossible for anything man-made to reach. Our client, some government contractor whose name got buried in classified paperwork, wanted it retrieved with no questions asked. The pay was good enough that none of us asked anyway. Amanda Chen hunched over her communications array, her black-rimmed glasses reflecting the green glow of her monitors. "Electromagnetic interference is increasing," she called out, tapping her screen with obvious frustration. "It's not following any pattern I recognize." I glanced at my own instruments and felt that familiar knot in my chest. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the last 100 meters, way faster than normal thermal gradients. Our pressure gauges climbed steadily into the red zone that marked the edge of the Kronos' operational limits. "Kenny, how are the robotic systems responding?" Rodriguez asked. Kenny Gregory looked up from his control station, his reddish hair sticking up at odd angles. "Arms are functioning normally, but I'm getting some weird feedback from the sensors. Nothing I can't handle, just different." Winter Rios, our life support specialist, frowned at his tablet. "Atmospheric pressure inside the cabin is holding steady, but I'm seeing minor fluctuations that don't match our depth readings." I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Deep-sea operations always carried risks, and strange readings weren't unusual when you pushed equipment to its limits. But something about this descent felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The sonar painted a picture of the ocean floor below us, jagged underwater mountains and deep trenches carved by geological forces that operated on timescales beyond human comprehension. The landscape looked alien, which it basically was. Humans didn't belong down here. "Reducing speed to approach velocity," Rodriguez announced. "Target coordinates in sight." Through the reinforced viewing port, I watched the last traces of filtered sunlight disappear completely. We were now in a world of absolute darkness, lit only by the Kronos' powerful floodlights that cut narrow beams through the water ahead. The lights revealed small patches of seafloor, gray sediment and scattered rocks that looked like they'd been sitting undisturbed for millions of years. "Object signature is strengthening," Amanda reported, her voice tight with concentration. "Whatever's down there, it's massive. Density readings suggest metal composition, but the electromagnetic properties are all wrong." I leaned forward to check my own displays. The target showed up as a dark mass on our forward-looking sonar, roughly circular, but with edges that seemed to shift between scans. Probably just interference from the weird electromagnetic readings Amanda kept mentioning. "Hayden, prep the tethering systems," Rodriguez ordered. "We'll want to secure the object before attempting any lifting procedures." I moved to the harpoon controls, running through the familiar checklist that had become second nature over the years. Load the reinforced cable, check the pneumatic pressure, verify the winch capacity. Standard salvage protocol, even if nothing else about this mission felt standard. The Kronos settled into its final approach, and I felt the subtle shift in engine vibration that meant we'd reached our operational depth. 4 kilometers down, in water so deep that the pressure outside could crush a human body in milliseconds. "There," Winter said, pointing through the observation port. "I can see something." I pressed my face to the reinforced glass and stared into the darkness ahead. Our floodlights illuminated a section of seafloor that looked different from the surrounding terrain. Instead of the usual gray sediment, something dark and smooth stretched across the bottom, its surface reflecting our lights in ways that made my eyes water. "That's our target," Rodriguez confirmed, checking her navigation display. "Amanda, start recording everything. Kenny, deploy the scanning equipment." As the robotic arms extended from the Kronos' hull, I got my first clear look at what we'd come to retrieve. The object sprawled across the seafloor like a massive shadow, its size impossible to judge accurately from our current position. The surface looked smooth, almost organic, with flowing curves that seemed to hurt when I looked at them directly. "Sonar readings are inconsistent," Amanda called out, her voice cracking slightly. "The object is showing up as both solid and hollow simultaneously. That's not possible." I checked my own instruments and felt ice form in my stomach. The readings made no sense. According to our equipment, the thing below us was both there and not there, dense as metal, but empty as water. "Keep scanning," Rodriguez ordered, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. "We need more data before we proceed." The Kronos hovered above our target, its lights painting red laser lines across the object's surface. The texture didn't look like rock or metal, or any biological material I'd ever seen. It looked like something that shouldn't exist, and as I watched, I could swear the whole mass was breathing. I pressed my face against the reinforced glass and tried to make sense of what our floodlights revealed. The object stretched across the seafloor in a pattern that defied every salvage operation I'd ever worked. Instead of the clean, geometric lines you'd expect from a crashed aircraft or sunken vessel, this thing flowed like spilled oil, its edges blending into the surrounding sediment in ways that made my depth perception go haywire. "Jesus," I muttered, adjusting the external light controls to get a better view. "How big is this thing?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Amanda said, her voice tight with frustration. She tapped her sonar display hard enough to make the whole console shake. "The readings keep changing. 1 second it's showing a mass roughly 50 meters across, the next it's registering as something 10 times that size." Captain Rodriguez moved between our stations, checking each display with the methodical precision that had kept us alive through 15 years of deep-sea operations. "Kenny, deploy the scanning array. I want detailed measurements before we proceed." Kenny's hands moved across his controls, extending the robotic arms from the Kronos' hull. Arms are responding normally, but... He frowned at his feedback display. "I'm getting resistance, like something's pushing back against the equipment." I watched through the observation port as our scanning lasers painted red grid lines across the object's surface. The texture looked wrong in ways I couldn't explain. Not metallic, not rocky, not biological. It reminded me of something I'd seen in a nightmare once, all flowing curves that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Temperature readings are all over the place," Winter called out from his station. "Some sections are showing near freezing. Others are registering temperatures that should be boiling the surrounding water." Amanda pulled off her glasses and cleaned them with shaking hands. "The electromagnetic interference is getting worse. It's like the thing is generating its own field, but the patterns don't match anything in our databases." I checked my own instruments and felt that familiar knot in my stomach tighten. The pressure readings inside our cabin had started fluctuating in tiny increments that shouldn't have been possible. We were in a sealed environment, but somehow the presence of this thing was affecting our internal systems. "Captain," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "maybe we should reconsider the approach. These readings don't make sense." Rodriguez shot me a look that reminded me why she'd survived 2 decades of maritime operations. "We have a job to do, Torres. The client wants this object retrieved, and that's what we're going to do." Kenny cursed under his breath as his robotic arm controls sparked. The precision cutter just died. Soon as it touched the surface, the whole system shut down. "Equipment failure?" Rodriguez asked. "No, that's the weird part. All the diagnostics show the cutter is functioning perfectly. It just won't operate when it gets within a few centimeters of the target." I watched the scanning lasers continue their sweep across the object's surface, revealing details that made my skin crawl. The texture looked almost organic, like skin or muscle tissue, but with a quality that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. In some spots, our beams seemed to disappear entirely, as if the thing was swallowing the photons. "The mass extends much deeper than we initially thought," Amanda reported, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our deep penetration sonar is showing the object continues down into the seafloor for at least 200 meters. Maybe more." "That's impossible," Winter said, looking up from his tablet. "Nothing that size could have impacted the seafloor without creating a crater visible from space." I felt the Chronos shift slightly in the current, and through the observation port I could swear I saw the entire object pulse, just once like a heartbeat, sending ripples through the surrounding sediment. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked. "See what?" Rodriguez moved to the observation port beside me. "The thing moved. I'm sure of it." Amanda's fingers flew across her keyboard. "Seismic sensors aren't showing any movement, but the electromagnetic readings just spiked again. The temperature in our cabin seemed to drop several degrees, even though Winter's environmental controls showed everything operating normally." I rubbed my arms and tried to shake off the chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Hayden, prep the tethering system," Rodriguez ordered. "We're going to secure this thing and get it to the surface." I moved to the harpoon controls, running through the familiar checklist while fighting the growing certainty that we should abort this mission immediately. Load the reinforced cable, check the pneumatic pressure, verify the winch capacity. Everything tested normal, but my hands shook as I worked. "Captain, I really think we should reconsider," I said. "These readings are unlike anything I've seen in 15 years of salvage work." "Noted," Rodriguez replied without looking away from her navigation display. "Proceed with tethering protocols." I positioned the targeting system over what looked like the most solid section of the object. The crosshairs wavered as I tried to find a good penetration point, but the surface seemed to shift and flow even as I watched. "Amanda, are you recording all of this?" Rodriguez asked. "Every sensor we have is running," Amanda confirmed, "though I'm not sure how much of this data will make sense when we review it later." Kenny tried the precision cutter again, with the same result. "It's like the thing has some kind of defensive field. Our equipment just won't function near it." Winter's tablet chimed with another alert. "Pressure fluctuations are increasing. Still within safe parameters, but the pattern is getting more pronounced." I felt sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool air. Every instinct I'd developed over years of dangerous salvage operations was screaming at me to get away from this thing. But Rodriguez was right. We had a job to do, and the client was paying enough to cover our expenses for the next 6 months. "Targeting system locked," I reported, my finger hovering over the firing control. "Ready to deploy tether on your command." Through the observation port, I watched our floodlights play across the object's surface. The flowing organic texture seemed to pulse with its own rhythm now, and I could swear the whole mass was breathing. "Fire when ready," Rodriguez commanded. I took a deep breath and pressed the firing control, sending our reinforced harpoon down toward the thing that waited in the darkness below. I heard the satisfying thunk of the harpoon hitting its target, the sound carrying through the Kronos' hull like a promise that we'd finally gotten something right on this cursed mission. The reinforced cable went taut as our winch systems engaged, and for about 30 seconds everything proceeded exactly according to salvage protocol. Then the object moved. What I'd been staring at for the past hour, what we'd all assumed was some kind of inert wreckage, suddenly convulsed with a violence that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. The seafloor erupted in massive clouds of sediment as something enormous and very much alive thrashed beneath us. "What the hell?" Rodriguez started to shout, but her words got cut off as the Kronos lurched downward so hard I felt my stomach slam into my throat. The cable connecting us to whatever was down there had gone from slack to piano wire tight in less than a second. Our hull groaned with stress I'd never heard before, metal protesting against forces that were trying to drag us straight down into the abyss. "Emergency ballast release," Rodriguez yelled, her hands flying across the control panel. "Now!" Through the swirling clouds of debris, I caught my first real look at what we'd harpooned. Tentacles the size of subway cars unfurled from the mass, each one covered in surfaces that seemed to swallow our floodlights completely. The thing was huge. Not just big, but impossibly massive, like we'd somehow managed to wake up a mountain. Kenny screamed as his robotic arm controls exploded in a shower of sparks. The external equipment's gone. Something just ripped the whole array clean off. The creature's movement generated underwater currents that battered our vessel like we were a bath toy. I grabbed onto my console as the Kronos spun sideways, the reinforced hull shrieking under pressure that shouldn't have been possible at our current depth. "Pressure warnings across all systems," Winter shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Hull integrity is compromised." Amanda's instruments lit up like a Christmas tree, alarms blaring from every direction. Massive bioelectrical activity. Whatever this thing is, it's definitely alive. One tentacle, thick as an office building and covered in patterns that hurt to look at directly, rose through the water column toward us. I watched it approach through our observation port, my mind refusing to accept the scale of what I was seeing. The impact, when it came, felt like getting hit by a freight train. The reinforced viewing port spiderwebbed with cracks as the tentacle struck our hull. The sound was indescribable. Metal screaming, glass fracturing, and underneath it all, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the creature itself. "Emergency ballast release isn't working," Rodriguez called out, her voice tight with the kind of fear I'd never heard from her before. "The tether's holding us fast." I stared at my controls, watching readouts that made no sense. The winch system showed we were connected to something with a mass that exceeded our equipment's ability to measure. The cable should have snapped under this kind of stress, but somehow it held. Another tentacle swept past our hull, and I got a close look at the surface texture. It wasn't skin or scales or anything biological I recognized. The patterns seemed to shift and flow, creating optical illusions that made my eyes water and my head pound. "Cut the tether," Kenny yelled from his ruined station. "Just cut the damn thing." But I couldn't move. I stood frozen at my controls, watching through the cracked observation port as more tentacles emerged from the sediment cloud. The creature was turning toward us, and I realized with a terror that went deeper than anything I'd ever experienced that we weren't salvage operators anymore. We were prey. The thing we'd harpooned defied every natural law I thought I understood. It was too big, too alien, too fundamentally wrong to exist in the same universe as human beings. But it was here, it was awake, and our harpoon had made us part of whatever nightmare we'd stumbled into. The Kronos shuddered as another tentacle brushed against our hull, and I knew with absolute certainty that we were about to die in the most horrible way imaginable. The sound hit us like a physical blow, cutting through the Kronos' reinforced hull as if the metal was tissue paper. I felt the vibration pass straight through my bones and lodge itself in my brain, turning my thoughts to static. This wasn't just noise. It was something that attacked the nervous system directly, scrambling every signal between my ears and my spine. Amanda collapsed at her station, blood streaming from both ears as the sonic assault ruptured her eardrums. She hit the deck hard, her body convulsing as the sound waves tore through her skull. The sight of her writhing on the floor sent ice through my veins, but I couldn't move to help her. The creature's call had turned my muscles to jelly. "Emergency protocols!" Rodriguez screamed, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. She slammed against the control panel, hands clamped over her head as blood trickled between her fingers. "Cut the tether. Cut the dam." Her words dissolved into incoherent shouting as the sound intensified. The vibration wasn't random. It had rhythm, purpose, like the thing was trying to communicate. And the message was crystal clear. We didn't belong here. Winter doubled over and vomited across his console, the sonic attack destroying his inner ear's ability to maintain balance. He dropped to his knees, retching violently as his equilibrium completely failed. Kenny had it worse. He'd fallen flat on his back, blood pouring from his nose as the acoustic pressure did something horrible to the vessels in his brain. I forced myself toward the emergency controls, each step feeling like I was walking through concrete. My vision blurred and doubled as the creature's call scrambled my optic nerves. Through the cracked observation port, I could see massive tentacles wrapping around our hull, their surfaces covered in patterns that seemed to shift and flow even as I watched. The sound got stronger. Equipment panels sparked and died as the vibrations shook our systems apart. Amanda's convulsions stopped suddenly, and when I looked down at her, her eyes stared at nothing. The blood from her ears had spread across the deck in a dark pool. She was gone. Rodriguez started laughing, a high, broken sound that cut through even the creature's call. The sonic attack had snapped something fundamental in her mind, leaving her giggling at horrors that would have terrified her minutes earlier. She clapped her hands like a child watching fireworks, completely disconnected from reality. The creature tightened its grip on our hull, and I heard metal groaning under pressure that shouldn't have been possible. Each pulse of sound felt like someone driving nails into my skull, but I kept moving toward the tether controls. The emergency release was only 3 feet away, but it might as well have been on the moon. Kenny rolled onto his side, blood streaming from both nostrils as he pressed his palms against his ears. "Make it stop," he whimpered, his voice barely audible over the creature's call. "Please, just make it stop." But the thing wasn't finished with us. The sound changed pitch, becoming deeper and more resonant, and I realized with absolute terror that this was just the beginning. The creature was testing us, learning what frequencies would cause the most damage to human nervous systems. I reached for the tether release, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grip the controls. The sonic attack was turning my brain to mush, making simple motor functions nearly impossible. But I had to cut our connection to this thing before it killed us all. Through the observation port, I saw one massive eye, larger than our entire vessel, turn toward us with an intelligence that made my blood freeze. The creature knew exactly what it was doing to us, and it was enjoying every second of our suffering. I slammed my hand down on the emergency tether release with every ounce of strength I had left. The mechanism responded instantly, explosive bolts severing our connection to the nightmare below. The Kronos lurched upward so violently that my feet left the deck, the emergency ballast systems dumping every pound of weight we carried. We shot through the water column like a cork from a champagne bottle, spinning end over end as the creature's grip on our hull finally broke. The terrible sound that had been destroying our minds started to fade, but I could still feel those vibrations rattling through my bones, a reminder that would probably never leave me. Rodriguez had collapsed in her command chair, blood pooling beneath her head where she'd struck the console during one of the creature's attacks. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, but at least she was breathing. The insane laughter had stopped, replaced by an unconsciousness that might have been a mercy. Winter lay crumpled against the far bulkhead, completely out cold. Kenny had curled himself into a tight ball on the deck, still whimpering and pressing his hands over his ears, even though the sonic assault was fading. Blood continued to stream from his nose, but his eyes were open and tracking movement. Amanda hadn't moved since the convulsions stopped. I forced myself to check her pulse, knowing what I'd find, but needing to be certain. Her skin was already cooling, and when I lifted her eyelid, the pupils stared at nothing. The creature's call had killed her as surely as a bullet to the brain. The Kronos' automated system screamed warnings about our ascent rate, red lights flashing across every panel as we rocketed toward the surface. We were rising too fast, putting dangerous stress on our damaged hull, but I couldn't bring myself to slow our escape. Not while that thing might still be following us up from the depths. Through the spider-webbed observation port, I watched the water change from absolute black to deep blue as we climbed toward distant sunlight. The pressure readings dropped steadily, and with each meter of ascent, I felt a tiny bit of the terror ease its grip on my chest. The hull groaned and shuddered as rapid decompression stressed the damaged metal, but the Kronos held together. Whatever engineers had designed this vessel, they'd built it to survive the impossible. Cracks spread across interior panels and several more systems failed, but the main pressure hull maintained its integrity. Kenny uncurled slightly, looking around with eyes that had seen too much. Is it over? We're ascending, I told him, checking our depth gauge. 2 kilometers and climbing fast. The tether's cut. We're free. He started crying then, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. I didn't blame him. Part of me wanted to do the same thing. Winter stirred against the bulkhead, groaning as consciousness returned. He touched his ears, and his fingers came away bloody, but he was alive and aware. That was more than I'd dared hope for during the worst of the sonic attack. The water outside continued to lighten as we rose. 1 kilometer, 500 meters. The automated systems gradually stopped their warnings as our ascent rate fell within acceptable parameters. We were going to make it to the surface. When we finally broke through into sunlight, the sensation was like being reborn. Waves lapped against our hull instead of crushing pressure, and actual daylight streamed through the observation port. I'd never been so grateful to see the sky in my entire life. I stumbled to the communications array, most of which Amanda had been monitoring before. I pushed that thought away and focused on the emergency frequencies. My hands shook as I activated the distress beacon and grabbed the radio microphone. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is deep sea vessel Kronos requesting immediate medical evacuation. We have 1 fatality and multiple serious injuries. Position is... I checked our GPS coordinates, surprised that the system still functioned. Repeat. This is Kronos requesting emergency assistance. The response came within minutes. Coast Guard vessels were already en route to our position, having detected our emergency ascent on their monitoring systems. Help was coming. I did what I could for Rodriguez and Winter while we waited, checking their injuries and trying to stop the bleeding. Kenny had pulled himself into a sitting position but couldn't seem to stop shaking. None of us spoke about what we'd seen down there. What words could possibly describe it? When the rescue boats arrived, Coast Guard medics swarmed aboard the Kronos with professional efficiency. They took one look at Amanda and immediately focused on the survivors, loading Rodriguez onto a stretcher while checking Winter's head trauma. A paramedic examined the blood streaming from my ears and nose, shining lights in my eyes and asking questions about my symptoms. I answered as best I could, but my attention kept drifting to the dark water around our vessel. Something huge and ancient was down there, now fully awake and aware that humans had found its resting place. The creature we'd disturbed had been sleeping for who knows how long, and our harpoon had been the alarm clock that brought it back to consciousness. As the Coast Guard towed us towards shore, I stared back at the patch of ocean where we'd made our discovery. The water looked perfectly normal from the surface, blue and peaceful under the afternoon sun. But I knew what lurked beneath those waves, and the knowledge felt like a weight that would crush me for the rest of my life. The creature was still down there, and now it knew we existed. The hospital bed felt like a prison after 6 weeks, but the investigators weren't finished with me yet. They came in shifts: Coast Guard officials, insurance adjusters, some government types who never quite explained which agency they represented. All of them wanted the same thing: a rational explanation for what happened to the Kronos. "Let's go through this one more time, Mr. Torres." The latest investigator was a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses who took notes on everything I said. "You're claiming that a living creature attacked your vessel at 4,000 meters depth." "I'm not claiming anything. I'm telling you what happened." She made another note. "The official findings indicate catastrophic equipment failure, explosive decompression. The hull damage is consistent with rapid ascent under extreme pressure differential." "What about Amanda?" "Equipment failure doesn't explain. Miss Chen died from acoustic trauma caused by the hull breach. The sound of rushing water and collapsing bulkheads can reach lethal decibel levels in a confined space." I stared at her, feeling that familiar ache behind my eyes that had been constant since we surfaced. "You're saying the ship killed her. I'm saying the evidence supports mechanical failure, not..." She consulted her notes. "Tentacles the size of subway cars." They'd been through this same routine with Kenny Winter and Rodriguez. The official report was already written: catastrophic equipment failure resulting in explosive decompression and 1 fatality. Clean, simple, and completely wrong. The woman closed her folder. "Mr. Torres, you've suffered significant trauma: nitrogen narcosis, pressure-related psychosis, acoustic damage to your inner ear. These conditions can create vivid hallucinations that seem absolutely real to the patient." After she left, I lay in the hospital bed listening to the sound that had been following me for weeks. A low, deep vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The doctors couldn't find any physical cause for it, but I knew what I was hearing. The creature's call, echoing through my dreams and into my waking hours. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the Kronos, watching Amanda convulse on the deck while that thing's voice tore through our minds. The medical staff increased my sedatives, but the nightmares always found a way through. Rodriguez was 3 floors up in the psychiatric ward. I tried to visit him once, but the nurses said he spent his days warning anyone who would listen to never return to the deep ocean. His brain damage was permanent. Something about the sonic attack had scrambled the neural pathways in his frontal lobe. The doctors called it a miracle that he could still speak coherently. Kenny had recovered faster than any of us, at least physically. But when I called his room, he hung up as soon as he heard my voice. The nurses said he'd taken early retirement and was moving somewhere landlocked. Montana, maybe. Somewhere he'd never have to see the ocean again. Winter was the only one who would talk to me, though our conversations were limited. The hearing loss in both ears meant he had to read lips, and even then he missed half of what people said. He'd already accepted a position on surface vessels only: cargo ships, passenger ferries, anything that never went deeper than a few hundred feet. "You remember it too," I said during one of his visits. "The sound it made." He nodded, touching his damaged ears. Sometimes I think I can still hear it, but the doctors say that's just tinnitus from the trauma. What if it's not? Winter looked at me for a long moment, then shook his head. I can't think about that, Hayden. I have to believe it was just an accident, or I'll never be able to work again. 3 months after the incident, I was finally cleared for discharge. The physical injuries had healed, though my hearing would never be quite the same. The psychological evaluation was more complicated. The doctors wanted me to continue therapy for what they called post-traumatic stress disorder with auditory hallucinations. I was packing my few belongings when the call came from the nurses' station. Rodriguez had escaped from the psychiatric facility during the night shift. They found him 2 hours later at the nearest coastline, standing waist-deep in the surf and staring at the horizon. I drove to the beach where they'd found him. The orderlies were already there, trying to coax him back to shore, but Rodriguez wasn't moving. He stood perfectly still in the waves, whispering something I couldn't hear from the parking lot. Then he turned and looked directly at me through the hospital transport van's window. His eyes were clear and focused for the first time since the accident. He mouthed 3 words that I could read perfectly. "Don't go back." The orderlies finally got him into the van, but he kept staring at me until they drove away. That night, the sound in my head got stronger. The low-frequency vibration that had been haunting me for months became so intense that I couldn't think straight. I called the hospital, but they said it was just anxiety about my discharge. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in my apartment, staring at job listings on my laptop. Surface positions mostly. Harbor work, coastal shipping, nothing that went deeper than a few hundred feet. Safe, rational choices that any sane person would make after what I'd been through. Instead, I found myself scrolling through deep-sea positions, research vessels, oil platform support, salvage operations, the kind of work that took you far from shore, into waters where the bottom was measured in kilometers instead of meters. My phone rang. The caller ID showed a shipping company I'd never heard of. "Mr. Torres, this is Captain Walsh with Meridian Freight Lines. We have a position available on one of our cargo vessels. Deep Atlantic routes. 6-month contracts." I should have hung up. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to take a nice, safe job in a harbor somewhere. But Rodriguez's warning kept echoing in my head, mixing with that constant low-frequency sound that the doctors insisted was just trauma. "What kind of cargo?" I heard myself ask. "Standard freight. Electronics. Manufactured goods. Nothing unusual. The route takes us through some deep water, but it's a large vessel. Very stable. Excellent safety record." The sound in my head got louder, and I realized something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just random noise anymore. It had rhythm, purpose, like something calling from a great distance. "When do you need an answer?" "We're departing next week. The position is yours if you want it." I stared at my laptop screen, at all those safe, sensible job listings that would keep me on dry land for the rest of my life. Then I thought about Amanda, about the way that thing's voice had torn through her mind until there was nothing left. "I'll take it," I said, and immediately wondered if I'd lost my mind completely. But as I hung up the phone, the sound in my head finally went quiet for the first time in months. Whatever was calling to me from the deep water, it knew I was coming back. I stood alone on the deck of the Morgan's Dream, gripping the cold metal railing as another wave of nausea hit me. 2:47 a.m. according to my watch, and I hadn't slept more than an hour at a stretch since we'd left port 3 days ago. The nightmares were getting worse. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the Chronos, watching Amanda convulse on the deck while that sound tore through our minds. The ship's doctor had given me pills that were supposed to help, but they just made everything feel fuzzy without actually stopping the dreams. 6 months. That's how long it had been since the incident, and I was still hearing things that weren't there. At least, that's what the psychiatrists kept telling me. Post-traumatic stress disorder with auditory hallucinations. A nice, clean diagnosis that explained away everything I'd experienced down there. The Morgan's dream was nothing like the Kronos. This was a proper cargo freighter, 800 feet of steel and stability that could handle anything the Atlantic threw at us. We were carrying electronics and manufactured goods from Baltimore to Liverpool, following shipping lanes that had been used safely for decades. Normal work. Rational work. I'd tried staying on land after my discharge from the hospital. Took a job at a harbor in San Diego, nice and close to shore where the water was never more than 50 feet deep. But the sound in my head had gotten worse, not better. That low-frequency vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. It was strongest at night, when the harbor was quiet, and I could hear the waves lapping against the docks. My mother had been relieved when I told her I was going back to sea. She thought it meant I was getting better, moving past the trauma. She didn't understand that I wasn't running toward recovery. I was running toward the only place where the sound in my head made any kind of sense. The night was calm, barely any wind to speak of. The massive freighter cut through gentle swells that wouldn't have bothered a fishing boat, let alone something this size. Most of the crew was asleep below decks, trusting in the ship's automated systems and the watch rotation to keep us safe. I checked the time again. Still 40 minutes left on my security rounds. Then I could go back to my cabin and pretend to sleep until the next shift change. The routine was supposed to be comforting, but everything about being at sea felt wrong now. The sound of waves against the hull made my skin crawl instead of relaxing me. Captain Walsh had been understanding about my medical history. He'd read the incident reports from the Kronos, or at least the sanitized version that blamed everything on equipment failure. He knew I'd been through something traumatic, but he also needed experienced crew members for deep Atlantic crossings. Sometimes the best way to get back on a horse is to just climb back on, he'd told me during the interview. The ocean's not going anywhere, Torres. You can either let it beat you, or you can show it who's boss. I'd wanted to tell him that the ocean had already won, that there were things down there that made human beings look like insects, and our ships were just toys floating on the surface of something vast and hostile. But I needed the work, and he needed the crew. So I'd nodded and signed the contract. The deck was empty except for me, which was how I preferred it during the night watch. The other crew members were good people, but they asked too many questions about why I'd left deep-sea work. I'd gotten tired of making up stories about wanting a change of pace. I started my rounds at the bow, checking the cargo containers and making sure all the securing cables were tight. Standard procedure. Though on a night this calm, there wasn't much that could go wrong. The Morgan's dream was built for stability, not speed, and she rode the swells like they weren't even there. That's when I heard it. A low, deep sound rising from the water. Barely audible at first, just a vibration that I felt in my bones more than heard with my ears, but unmistakably familiar. I froze at the port railing, my hands gripping the metal so hard that my knuckles went white. The sound was distant but growing stronger, that same bone-deep trembling that had nearly destroyed my mind 6 months ago. No, this wasn't possible. We were in the middle of the Atlantic shipping lanes, thousands of miles from where the Kronos had made its discovery. The creature we'd encountered was a deep-sea bottom dweller, something that lived in the abyssal depths near underwater mountains. It couldn't be here. But the sound kept growing stronger. I fumbled for my radio, then stopped. What was I going to tell Captain Walsh? That I was hearing the call of a monster that officially didn't exist? That my post-traumatic stress was acting up again? The vibration intensified, and I felt that familiar ache behind my eyes. The same sensation that had preceded the sonic attack that killed Amanda. My vision started to blur as the frequency hit the exact pitch that had scrambled our nervous systems. Then I heard another sound. Different direction, slightly higher pitch, and another one from somewhere off the starboard side. Multiple sources, calling from different points across the vast ocean. I stumbled to the starboard railing, scanning the dark water for any sign of disturbance. The night was clear, with enough starlight to see the horizon, but the ocean looked perfectly normal, just gentle swells stretching away into darkness. The sounds were getting louder. Not just one creature now, but several. Their calls overlapping and harmonizing in ways that made my head pound. I pressed my palms against my ears, but the vibrations went deeper than sound. They were in my bones, in my blood, in the spaces between my thoughts. Through the darkness, I could see something that made my blood freeze. Disturbed water patterns on the horizon, white foam where massive shapes moved beneath the surface. Too far away to make out details, but close enough to see that something huge was displacing enormous amounts of water. The creatures were rising. I grabbed my radio with shaking hands. "Bridge, this is Torres on deck watch. We need to change course immediately." Captain Walsh's voice crackled back, thick with sleep. "Torres? What's your status?" "There's something in the water. Multiple contacts, very large. We need to get out of here now." "Slow down. What kind of contacts? Are you seeing other vessels?" How could I explain this? How could I make him understand that we were surrounded by things that shouldn't exist, creatures that had been sleeping in the deep places until something woke them up? "Not vessels. Something else. Please, Captain, you have to trust me on this." The line was quiet for a long moment. Then Walsh's voice came back, more alert now. "I'm coming to the bridge. Maintain your position and keep reporting." The sounds were getting stronger, and I could feel them affecting my nervous system the same way they had in the Chronos. My hands started shaking, and my vision doubled as the frequencies interfered with my optic nerves. But this time was different. The calls weren't directed at us, they were directed at each other. The creatures were communicating across vast distances, coordinating something that I couldn't begin to understand. Rodriguez had been right. We'd awakened something old and terrible, and now more of them were answering the call. I watched the disturbed water patterns spread across the horizon, massive shapes moving through the depths with purpose and intelligence. Whatever signal our encounter with the first creature had sent, it had reached others. They were rising from trenches and abyssal plains across the world's oceans, responding to a summons that had been triggered by a simple salvage operation. The real nightmare wasn't what we'd found in the deep. It was what we'd told the rest of them that humanity existed.